Imagine this. You have a woman, and she walks into the heavily guarded compound of a pretty powerful warlord in the mountains of Yemen, and she doesn't bring a briefcase full of cash or anything like that. She doesn't bring a treaty.
Right.
Instead, she pulls out a blade, cuts off several strands of her own hair, and just hands them to him. And in that single, seemingly bizarre motion, she entirely bypasses the modern legal system, halts a massive government crackdown, and brings an entire region to the absolute brink of armed warfare.
I mean, it sounds like a scene from some historical epic, but this actually happened in 2026.
Yeah.
And the geopolitical shockwaves that it sent out were very, very real.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're getting into today on the deep dive. This is where we take the sources you want to understand, the research papers, the articles, and we extract the most important insights so you can get a real grasp on the underlying mechanics of power.
Exactly. We are dissecting the case of Sumayah Ahmed Al-Zubairi. So for a decade, she essentially embedded herself in Yemen's elite political circles under a completely fabricated identity. She called herself Colonel Mira Saddam Hussein.
Which is just, I mean, it's wild.
It really is. She claimed, quite literally, to be the hidden daughter of the late Iraqi dictator.
And, the reason you should care about this deep dive isn't just because it's some incredible con job. It's because her case forces us to look at this extreme, high-stakes version of something happening all over the world. It's a massive collision over who actually gets to dictate reality.
Right.
We're going to look at what happens when ancient tribal law, modern state-run DNA labs, and the viral algorithms of social media all just crash into each other in a deeply fractured country.
Yeah, and to really understand how one individual could paralyze a whole region, you need to start by looking at the specific psychological weapon she used. I mean, she didn't just pick a random fake name out of a hat.
No.
She deliberately appropriated a very specific, very potent historical ghost.
Right. She claimed the lineage of Saddam Hussein. And we really have to unpack why that worked so incredibly well in this context. Because in the cultural mindset of the Yemeni tribal belt, that specific legacy carries massive sociological weight.
Oh, absolutely.
It's this hyper-romanticized symbol of pan-Arabist resistance. So it projects this aura of defiance, of, untouchable authority.
And she weaponized that exact aura. I mean, she arrived on the scene with this elaborate backstory supported by expertly forged Ba'ath Party credentials.
Fake military documentation.
Yeah, exactly, all the fake paperwork.
Yeah.
And she didn't just ask for favors, she demanded the respect that would be owed to exiled royalty. And the local elite, who were eager to align themselves with that kind of historical prestige, they just bought into it completely.
And saying they bought into it is almost an understatement, honestly. She used this intimidating persona as essentially a blank check to shake down the local establishment. We are talking about staggering material wealth here.
Yeah, the sources outline some serious assets.
Right. They detail a luxury villa in Sanaa's highly exclusive Hatta district. She accumulated 50 kilograms of gold, luxury cars, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. I mean, she built an absolute empire purely on a historical alias.
It was a wildly successful grift.
Yeah.
But the critical moment, the actual flashpoint that escalated this from a simple domestic fraud investigation into a major regional security crisis, happened when the de facto state authorities in Sana'a finally caught on.
Right.
They started closing the net. They wanted those assets back, and they wanted her arrested.
And this is where the story takes that wild left turn. Because if you or I are facing massive fraud charges, we hire a defense attorney, we look for a loophole in the civil code.
Sure.
But she didn't do that at all. She engaged an entirely different operating system of law.
Yeah, she traveled directly to the home of Sheikh Hamad bin Rashid Fedem El Hazmi.
Yeah.
And he is a highly prominent leader of the Dahm tribes. And there, right in his home, she performed Qass al-Fara'id. She cut her hair.
Wait, hold on. Stop right there, because I want to make sure we make this crystal clear for the listener. Because to a modern urban observer, cutting your hair is just, a trip to the salon.
Right, or maybe a symbolic gesture of grief.
Exactly, maybe a protest. But you're saying this was a binding legal maneuver? Just by handing over a lock of hair, this tribal leader is legally bound to protect her. Like, no questions asked.
Under traditional Yemeni customary law, which is known as al-Aslaf wa al-Araf, yes. It is an explosive, basically unignorable legal trigger.
Wow.
Because in the anthropological context of the Arabian Peninsula, a woman's hair is deeply, intimately tied to personal honor, to bodily autonomy and privacy. So the ritualized cutting of the hair and presenting it to a tribal patriarch is the ultimate distress signal.
It's a severe escalation.
Yeah, it's a concept known as istihatha. It's
Yeah.
definitive proof of severe, life-threatening vulnerability.
So it's essentially saying, the modern state has failed me or is actively hunting me, and I am physically surrendering my safety entirely into your hands.
Precisely. By executing this specific ritual, she formally transferred her vulnerability out of the jurisdiction of the state's police force and directly into the jurisdiction of the host tribe's collective honor.
And the sources mention that Sheikh Hamad accepted those strands of hair, and he even noted in interviews later that he physically carried them around in his pocket as proof of the exchange.
Yeah, he kept them on him.
Which is fascinating. And once he took that hair, she entered a highly specific legal category called al-Rabika, which means total tribal guardianship. It's like she hacked a cultural mainframe. I mean, she found the one ancient code that overrides all modern civil law.
That is a really perfect way to look at it.
Yeah.
It is a cultural override, and this is where the underlying rules of customary law become terrifyingly inflexible. Because the objective truth of who she is, whether she's actually a deposed Iraqi princess or just a local fraudster named Sumayah, it just ceases to matter.
Right.
That truth becomes completely secondary to the immediate absolute obligation to protect someone who has sought asylum through this sacred ritual.
But surely there has to be an outright. Like, if the sheik finds out she's a con artist hoarding gold and luxury cars, can't he just hand her over to the cops and say, hey, my mistake, she lied to us?
He cannot. And the reason he cannot is the profound cultural dread of Al-Aib Al-Aswad, which translates to the black shame.
Black shame, yeah.
Right. If the Dahm and Bakil tribes surrendered her to the state authorities after accepting her as istiatha, the cultural penalty is absolute and generational. It's not just a fine, you know. They would immediately lose their political standing.
Right, they lose everything.
They lose their moral authority. They lose their vital capacity to act as neutral arbiters in any future intertribal disputes. It permanently stains the bloodline of the leadership.
That is such a powerful human emotion to leverage. It's the utter dread of losing your status forever. So they're essentially trapped by their own ancestral code. They have to defend her, or they lose their fundamental identity as a tribe.
Exactly. They were structurally forced to call for al-Nakash. And this is a general, armed tribal mobilization.
Which is serious.
Very serious. Once that call goes out, from the perspective of customary law, any attempt by the Senate government to arrest her is no longer seen as a police action. It is interpreted as a direct, kinetic military assault on the host tribe's sacred honor.
Which sets up this incredibly tense, almost impossible dynamic. You have a tribal coalition that is operating on an unwritten ancestral legal framework where ritual basically dictates reality. And if the state sends in tanks and troops to get her, they risk massive destabilization, thousands of casualties, and a literal regional war.
Right.
So how does a government fight a cultural mainframe hack like that?
Well, they realized they couldn't just use kinetic military force without sparking a bloodbath. They had to deploy a countermeasure that could systematically dismantle that ancestral exception. They had to change the battlefield entirely. So they chose modern forensic science.
They use a DNA swab instead of an AK-47.
Exactly. They used science as an aggressive, offensive instrument of sovereign statecraft. The authorities in Customary subjected the claimant to genetic testing and DNA profiling.
And the results were a pretty brutal reality check. The lab produced an unassailable biological fact, which was a 99.99% genetic match to a local Yemeni citizen named Sumayah Ahmed Al-Zubairi.
Right.
No Iraqi royal blood whatsoever.
And by introducing that hard biological fact, the state effectively cornered the tribes. They shifted the entire paradigm. The state essentially said, look, we are not debating tribal chivalry here. We are not insulting your honor by arresting a political exile. We are executing a standard administrative warrant for criminal identity theft and forgery.
And we really have to talk about how the state handled the PR here, because it was brilliantly ruthless.
Yeah.
They didn't just quietly file a DNA report in some dusty cabinet and ask the sheikh to read it, you know?
No.
They produced a highly polished, primetime, televised documentary expose. They literally brought in her actual biological father, a man named Ahmed Al-Zubairi from the Arhab tribe, to testify on camera that she was his daughter.
Yeah.
They laid out all the fake military badges, the forged Ba'ath Party cards for the whole country to see on high-definition video.
It was a systematic humiliation designed entirely to break the narrative. And we have to look closely at what the state was really after here structurally. Because yes, it was about enforcing the law, but it was also a massive maneuver of bureaucratic consolidation. At the heart of this standoff was that extremely valuable real estate in Sana'a.
the villa in the Haddad district.
Right. By investigating the property's titles through formal administrative channels, the state was aggressively asserting its monopoly over the land registry. Reclaiming that villa wasn't framed as an insult to the Dahm tribes, it was framed as correcting a clerical error made by a criminal.
But, I really want to push back on the state's motives here for a second. Let's really think about this from a sociological angle. Is the government's use of DNA profiling in this instance truly about a noble, objective pursuit of truth? Because looking at the sources, it feels highly cynical. It feels like a calculated authoritarian power grab. They are using the shiny veneer of objective science to break a tribal stalemate, consolidate their central power, and systematically seize elite, high-value assets in the capital for themselves.
And that is exactly the right question to ask. The deployment of forensic science in a fractured state is almost never neutral. It is a flex of sovereignty.
Exactly.
The government is demonstrating to everyone watching that its administrative bureaucracy, its property registries, and its DNA labs hold the ultimate supreme authority to define who you are. They're actively overriding centuries of ancestral custom with a lab coat and a microscope.
So the DNA test effectively shattered the tribe's physical defense. I mean, the tribe couldn't find a lab result with guns without looking like they were defending a common thief instead of an exiled princess. But this standoff didn't just end there. And this brings us to what I think is the most fascinating part of this deep dive. Because this didn't happen in 1996. It happened in 2026. The DNA test forced the tribes to pivot, and they took the fight to a completely different venue, which was the internet.
Yeah, and this is where we really have to bring in the analysis of sociologist Ali Al-Bukaidi, because his interviews provided a vital critique of how digital media algorithms have completely mutated the nature of this kind of conflict.
Right. He introduces this brilliant concept called the tribal trend, because historically, as we discussed, an al-Nakaf mobilization was a deadly, serious, high-stakes military duty. It meant kissing your family goodbye and preparing for brutal, sustained human casualties in the mountains.
It was kinetic.
But today, the Naka has been deeply penetrated by the mechanics of social media. Al-Bukaidi points out how armed tribesmen in remote desert valleys were actually optimizing their military encampments, or mata'ari, for TikTok and YouTube engagement.
Yeah, the physical gathering of heavily armed men was doubling as a stage for digital content creation. It wasn't about tactical supremacy anymore. It was about viral reach.
Wow.
You had the rhythmic firing of weapons into the air, the passionate recitation of tribal poetry, the dramatic performative smashing of smartphones, which actually happened in this case to protest the state's actions. All of it was carefully timed, lit, and framed for maximum distribution on digital platforms.
And this leads to what is honestly the most jarring, cynical revelation in Al-Bukhari's research. When he interviewed the tribal actors, the sheiks, the commentators, they admitted something wild. They knew she was lying, pretty much from the start. They knew she was not Mira Saddam Hussein.
Which completely upends our understanding of why they mobilized in the first place. If they knew it was a fraud, it wasn't actually about honor.
Exactly. Defending Saddam's daughter just became a highly useful narrative device. It was a mechanism for what sociologists call symbolic compensation.
Right.
Think about it. You have this landscape of political stagnation. You have these anti-regime actors who are deeply frustrated with the central authorities in Sana'a, and they latched onto this romanticized historical fiction to channel their broader political anger. It was a low-risk, performative proxy war. They didn't actually want to fight a kinetic war with the state. They just wanted the digital visibility of looking like they were resisting the state.
But, I mean, let me challenge that modern mutation for a second from a structural perspective.
Okay.
If the tribal leadership fundamentally knew she was a fraud from the beginning, and this was all for show, doesn't that inherently degrade the sacred weight of the Qass al-Fara'id ritual?
That's a fair point.
I mean, how can the dread of the black shame hold any real customary power if the entire armed mobilization is essentially just theatrical content engineered for internet clout?
And that is the ultimate paradox of the digital age. The cultural structure still demands the physical performance. She has to cut the hair, the men have to gather with their guns. But the execution of that obligation has migrated almost entirely to the digital sphere. It's a facade.
Right.
And we know it's a facade because of how it ended. When these host sheikhs were ultimately faced with the cold, hard reality of the state's DNA evidence, the televised humiliation, and the threat that the state might actually use real military force, The performative resistance just crumbled.
Yeah, they didn't initiate a major regional war. No shots were actually fired at government troops.
No. They shifted to traditional low-stakes fallback maneuvers. They set up localized roadblocks. They made demands for financial compensation from rival clans they'd just saved face. The digital release valve of online views completely replaced the need for actual kinetic warfare.
Wow.
The standoff fizzled out precisely because the knockoff had become a social media trend rather than a tactical military deployment. They got their views, the state got the villa, and everyone went home.
So let's connect all these pieces for the listener. What does this all mean when we synthesize these competing paradigms? We are looking at a deeply fractured environment where the very nature of reality is actively being contested by different operating systems of power.
Yeah.
On one side, you have a state apparatus utilizing DNA profiling, public relations broadcasts, and bureaucratic registries to aggressively enforce its legitimacy and strip away the traditional autonomy of the rural regions.
And on the other side, you have the tribal networks desperately clinging to ancient, deeply emotional rituals like Qass al-Fara'id and the collective honor codes of al-Bika to protect their ancestral jurisdiction from government overreach.
But then layered on top of both of those physical realities is the digital paradigm. You have modern actors leveraging the conflict itself, utilizing algorithmic trends to accumulate symbolic power. They are turning what used to be serious, bloody geopolitical friction into curated, low-risk online theater.
It's like we are watching an ancient cultural operating system get hacked by a tradition, patched by modern science, and then ultimately infected by a digital virus where only engagement metrics matter.
That's a great way to put it.
Which leaves you with a lingering, provocative question to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We've seen how identity can be brilliantly weaponized to exploit the gap between unwritten tradition and formal scientific law. But if the ancient life-or-death rituals of human survival are now being actively curated for social media algorithms, who really holds the ultimate sovereign power today?
Right. Is it the state with its sterile DNA labs and property deeds? Is it the tribe with its guns and historical honor codes? Or is it the unseen digital platforms silently dictating what captures our collective attention and turning warfare into content?
When a single identity fraudster can paralyze a region simply by standing at the intersection of those three forces, it becomes clear that the concept of a unified objective reality is the first casualty of modern conflict. We started this deep dive looking for the traditional architecture of a standoff, a border dispute, a broken treaty. But as we've seen, the battle lines today aren't drawn on a map. They are drawn in the space between our genetics, our ancestral instincts, and the screens we stare at every day.
It is a fascinating and somewhat unsettling new reality.
Absolutely. So take that question with you and keep questioning the reality of the standoffs you see in your own feeds.